Is the universe an all-encompassing domain?
The notion of universe, so this is a thing that is part of the material. The universe isn't a container of stuff. It's actually a collection of three concepts. It's essentially the notion of universe is the superposition of the concept of creation, existence, and interaction. And the way that we can see this is by asking, if I knew everything there is to know about creation, everything there is to know about existence, and everything there is to know about interaction, would there be anything that was part of the universe that was not part of one or more of those three? And so, in that particular sense, I don't have to think of the universe as a container that contains things. I can think of it as a container that contains concepts. And those three concepts turn out to be distinct, inseparable, and non interchangeable as part of the consideration of what we mean by universe. So, in that particular sense, we've moved in a different way in terms of how we consider the notion. And I would regard that this way of understanding the concept of universe, if anything, is actually more complete and more consistent and more correct with how that term actually works and the way in which we would normally use it in language, is as far as founding theories of physics and things like that are concerned. That's quite a leap, I will admit, but that's part of the way in which the metaphysics works. Because if we're dealing with the domain of the universe, what are the concepts or what are the constructs that effectively allow us to really get at the root of the domain? Well, it's hard to understand anything about the universe without understanding creation, existence, and interaction. And so, in a similar way, when we're trying to understand the nature of the real, we can say, well, the three concepts there would be choice, change, and causation. Or if I was wanting to understand music, I might talk about it in terms of things like the notion of melody or structure, the notion of tonality, i.e., that I can distinguish, say, a violin playing an A note from a piano playing an A note, or a flute playing an A note, right? So, in other words, it's the same note, same intensity, but different instrumentation. I can distinguish that. And the notion of intensity itself, like what volume is it played at? So, in a sense, those become kind of the root constructs that are assumed by literally everything else when thinking about music. We mentioned language a while ago. So, for instance, if I'm treating the domain of language as a body of study, I might think about things like sentences, syntax, and semantics. And to basically say that if we're looking at that process, that really we need to understand language, we need to understand those three things. Or that if we were looking at some process of understanding comparison, or if we're trying to understand the notion of the metrics of physics and so on and so forth, we'll see this same pattern of three, or in some of these cases, three pairs of two, and that these have essentially structural relationships that uphold all of these concepts in very specific ways. So at first, you can think about the metaphysics as if it was an inquiry into the nature of the relationships between concepts, like every domain might be treated as essentially a field of study. And we're looking at the term definitions in that field of study. And we're doing a topological sort on the dictionary of those term definitions to identify what are the root terms. And then when we discover that three of those terms have this sort of distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable characteristic, and they're pretty close to the deepest things we can think about in that domain, then we might basically say, does it follow the axiom 1 test? We just passed the axiom 3 test. We might go and say, does it look like one of these three concepts that we've identified as distinct, inseparable, and non-interchangeable act as essentially a counterweight against the other two, which are in a sense counterweights for each other? So in effect, are we experiencing a kind of reciprocal relationship between two of those concepts, and those two taken together with one of those concepts? And that effectively identifies what would be the immanent concept in the theory of that domain. And then when we're looking at axiom 2, we can essentially distinguish those two concepts that they're in reciprocal relationship. Or in the way the axiom 1 is actually stated, we use the word conjugate, but there's the technical reasons for that we can refer to later.